Hi, my name's Phil. I'd like to talk about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the mess that the government's latest piece of incompetence has left us in regarding COVID and the new scientific research indicating that we've allowed a new coronavirus variant with some resistance to the vaccine to emerge and potentially get a foothold in the country. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, didn't take long for the government to mess up again, did it? You know, wasn't it only yesterday that I was saying, look, the government's looking good now in the press on the COVID front because we seem advanced with our vaccine rollout compared to some of our neighbours, but that was because we got the NHS to deliver it, and it wouldn't take long before politics made a mess of it all. A matter of hours, that opinion held, a matter of hours that it lasted. Essentially, this is the situation. We already have a variant in Britain which seems to be more transmissible, potentially much more transmissible than the coronavirus that had been doing the rounds for nearly a year in this country. This variant is known as B117. Then we heard of other variants around South Africa, Brazil, and which was also potentially showing some resistance to the vaccines. Now, some resistance doesn't mean that the vaccine is useless or nowhere near as effective. It just means not quite as effective. It doesn't even necessarily mean that it wouldn't be of acceptable efficacy, effectiveness. We'd need more information for that. But anyway, in terms of the chronology, in terms of the order in which things happened. So, the government's scientific advisors in SAGE, as well as independent scientists, were telling the government, we need to control our borders immediately. We need to stop these variants that have been spotted around the world from getting into this country. We've got enough problems of our own because you've been ignoring us for the past 10 months. Never mind how things were going in the media, the experts knew that we're right up against it. And the last thing they needed was something that makes the vaccines, which now is our only hope given that test and trace is a complete shambles, making that vaccine less effective. And remember, the vaccine as it is isn't 100% effective. It doesn't guarantee you protection against the virus if you are fully vaccinated. And very few people are fully vaccinated at the moment. Now, the government did announce something about applying restrictions to people coming in to the country, particularly from the likes of South Africa and Brazil, as well as some other places. But the advice was to check everyone. Again, problem with competence here. 3 weeks ago, this came up in the liaison committee, which is a group of MPs who basically ask questions of the Prime Minister in a committee hearing. So Labour MP Yvette Cooper asked the Prime Minister in this parliamentary committee meeting what the government was doing to prevent the spread of this South African variant. She asked why it was possible, perfectly legally possible, for people to travel from South Africa to somewhere else, let's say Dubai, she said as one example, to the UK, all perfectly legal. They wouldn't need a test or anything like that. They could just come into the country and go wherever. And Johnson replied that, we're going to apply these checks, but he ultimately on that particular issue said he didn't know why. He didn't have an answer for it. He said he would look into people getting into the UK from South Africa or from other countries where we've got restrictions in place via a circuitous route. So basically he hadn't even thought of people travelling indirectly from one place to another. Okay, good. Glad we've got someone in the ball on charge, particularly as his father did exactly that to get around restrictions in Europe last summer. He went, because you weren't directly allowed to go from the UK to certain countries in Europe, he just went somewhere else and then to that other country. Anyway, then we get a report this week, which was the worrying thing for me, saying that SAGE warned the government 2 weeks ago that only mandatory quarantine for all travellers into the country would prevent these new strains arriving in the UK. They said you cannot stop it with just this targeted nonsense approach. It's got to be for everyone coming into the country, and you've got to have this period of quarantine. As usual, Boris Johnson took their advice with a mixture of compromise and incompetence. He said that they would require it of some travellers and didn't even implement that properly. The bottom line is there is now a scientific paper out which will be troubling, which I'll link below. Now, what you may have seen is fears that this South African variant has been identified in people in the south of England. There's like 8 parts of the south of England, including a few parts of London, where it's been identified, and it's been identified in people who haven't travelled recently. So we're not talking about people who've picked it up abroad and we've picked it up now in this country. No, they've picked it up from someone else. So someone's brought it into the country, unwittingly of course, passed it on to someone else. Maybe there's a whole chain, but some people who have not been out of the country have picked it up now. It's here, and of course that means it's spreading. But it's a bit more serious than that, because we're not just talking about the fact that we've got this South African variant. The research paper shows that they have identified the South African mutation known as E484K that provides some resistance, combined with the B117 variant, the so-called Kent variant, the transmissible form, or the more transmissible form. So that basically means now we have, at a low level, hopefully at the moment, we have a variant doing the rounds that is both more transmissible and showing signs of resistance to the vaccine. Not different variants combined within the same one. Now, the conclusion is that the vaccines that we're currently rolling out will be less effective against this variant. So if this variant spreads across the country and becomes one of the common strains at some point, which isn't at the moment, but if it does, then there will be a measurable reduction in the protection offered by our vaccination program. Remember, like I said, even when you've had your second dose of vaccine, and even if you get it in a reasonable time, and all that is still to be determined whether that happens, because those second doses are not really being handed out yet, apart from for the Prime Minister's father, of course. But you've got, that doesn't give you 100% protection. You don't get to behave as if, oh, I'm fine now, I've had my second dose. It's given you, I think, something like 90%, depends. But this one reduces it. By how much? We don't know. Now, like I said, to avoid going over the top, doesn't mean the vaccine won't be useful. Of course it will. And it's not like, as I say, we're going from 90% protection to say like something like 50% or something. It's not quantified yet. More research needs doing, of course. The take home is that we have a combination of mutations in the same variant identified in our population. More transmissible, meaning that it's harder to stop it spreading, and more resistant, which means that the vaccine is less likely to protect you. In other words, when you take the whole population of vaccinated people, when we eventually get one, more people will still get COVID, even though they've been vaccinated. Because some will anyway, but more will, even though they've been vaccinated. That's what that means. And this has been caused because of the government's cavalier attitude to the scientific advice that they have received. Their insistence on watering it down at every turn. So now the government are trying to clear up this mess by instigating mass testing in the areas where it's been identified. So in these 8 areas, they've said, look, really, really, we mean it now. You've got to stay inside. And they're doing like door-to-door testing and things like that, I gather. And I suppose that shows how seriously the government are taking it. Because like I said, I don't want to over-dramatise this. It is serious, but I don't want to pretend it's a meteor coming to wipe us all off the face of the earth. But the government carrying out door-to-door tests, getting the mobile testing in, they're really rolling out the tests for these areas and really trying to enforce the message that you don't go out. The government, that sounds to me like the government are taking it seriously. Only, I wonder if they're taking it seriously enough, because, as a few people have pointed out, the government carrying out these tests only works if 3 things happen, or 3 things follow, shall we say. So you've done your test, 3 things then need to happen. 1, the tests have to be returned quickly. Tests are supposed to be returned within 24 hours. It doesn't always happen. Very often doesn't happen. It has to happen. You have to get them quickly so that you can actually act. You've got to get the information quickly. None of this nonsense about receiving notification, oh, you had COVID a couple of weeks ago. Secondly, people who test positive need to be able to self-isolate. Now that means that they're going to need to be able to access funds to pay the bills whilst they're not earning any wages. Thirdly, contact tracing has to be effective in getting into contact everyone who was in contact with the people testing positive to self-isolate themselves. Now, I don't know if the results are being returned quickly at the moment in those areas, I have to say, but let's say that the government were taking this seriously. The government could fast track those ones. The government actually could just, with a word, insist that those results are prioritised and that they get back within the 24 hours. The government could do that. They have the power to do that. Second one is, so what I don't know basically, in fact second and third, I don't know that we have the necessary financial support for people without savings to isolate for if they test positive. In fact, in terms of unless they put something special in place for those areas, in terms of the general picture, we don't. There isn't that in place. The government keeps saying, oh, we've put this in place, this in place. No, they haven't. Basically, there are people who, if they test positive, have to make a choice between doing the right thing for the population and isolating, or getting the money that stops them starving on the streets. That is a choice faced by people in this country, whether or not the closeted middle classes understand it or not. And finally, I know that our test and trace is not contacting enough people. The system is still an absolute mess. So as someone pointed out on Twitter, if the government don't put in place the measures needed to make the tests effective, if that follow-up isn't there, all they're doing with their mass testing is keeping score for the virus, they said. Now, finally, in terms of the politics, so I noticed that The Times, which is a conservative newspaper, although not necessarily one that's awfully supportive of the current leadership, is reporting that Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, and Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, argued for the scientific advice to be adopted regarding border restrictions, and that Boris Johnson overruled them that couple of weeks ago. Of course, this could just be the result of off-the-record briefings as ministers continue to distance themselves from Boris Johnson ahead of a possible change of leadership later down the line, and the Times being only too happy to heap more pressure on a Conservative leader that they never really seem to have much respect for. I'd hardly say that the paper is doing its best to inform the public of the facts, because at the bottom of the article it also produced the misleading statement that over half of 70-year-olds have been vaccinated. They know that this is not true at all. Not at all. At best, what they actually mean is half the over 70s have received a single dose of the vaccine, which, remember, gives you less than 50% protection against the dominant forms of coronavirus, and presumably less still against this new variant, which has not yet established a foothold and the government are trying to stamp out. At the same time, it would have been easier to do that. It's always better to lock the stable door before the horse has bolted. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.